The transport shuttle descended slowly, its engines humming as the metallic behemoth cut through the thin, cold atmosphere of the barren moon. Caleb Wren could feel the faint shudder of the craft as it touched down on the cracked, copper-red surface of Varela 3. Dust swirled and settled around the landing gear like an ancient, forgotten storm. The ramp hissed open, revealing the uninviting, jagged landscape. Caleb stepped out onto the alien soil, feeling the dry wind scrape against his skin like tiny, abrasive needles. His boots crunched against the coarse, mineral patches that spread in all directions. The air was thick, not quite suffocating, but heavy, laced with an acrid tang that made his throat itch. The sky above him was a swirling vortex of violet and blue, a dusky haze where no sun could be seen, only the filtered glow of a gas giant looming nearby. The distant horizon stretched endlessly, jagged rock formations dotting the landscape in sharp contrast to the bulbous, alien growths that clung to the surface like sickly tumors. Caleb wasn't here to appreciate the view, though. This wasn't some sightseeing excursion. This was the fifth and final phase of the Galactic Interact Academy's survival gauntlet, his test. A survival test with no weapons, no tools, and absolutely no food. There would be no tech. No drones. No rations. The rules were simple: survive for 5 full planetary cycles, or, about 100 Earth hours, using only the resources provided by Varela 3. It sounded brutal. And, as Caleb looked around at his fellow cadets, he knew it was going to be harder than anyone anticipated. He was the only human in the group. The others came from various worlds, all with vastly different approaches to life, survival, and the challenges they faced. Some were from lush, fertile planets where food grew in abundance, and others hailed from cold, inhospitable worlds where survival required a careful balance of strength and ingenuity. Most of them had never had to forage for food in their lives. Most had never known the sensation of hunger gnawing at their stomachs, forcing them to make quick decisions between safety and sustenance. The idea of surviving on their wits alone was foreign to them. They were accustomed to technology, tools, and well-stocked supplies. Caleb was different. Back on Earth, growing up in the rugged, untamed wilderness, he had learned early on how to survive without modern comforts. His grandfather had raised him with stories of old, stories of trekking through the forests of the Rockies, of hunting for food in the cold, harsh winters. Caleb had learned that the land could be cruel, but it was also generous if you knew how to take from it. Now, standing on this barren moon, Caleb felt a strange sense of comfort. This place, though hostile, reminded him of home in a way that made his pulse steady. While others were scrambling for shelter, their faces filled with fear or uncertainty, Caleb took his time. He didn't rush. He moved deliberately toward the ridge in the distance, where the land seemed to dip into a shadowed valley. "Hey, human," a voice called from behind him, dripping with mockery. "Planning to eat dirt already?" Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew who it was. Serac, a cadet from the sulfur-rich world of Trexus Prime. Serac was known for his arrogance, his complete reliance on nutrient injectors and photoreactive feeding paths. He was one of the privileged ones, a cadet who had never known real struggle. As Caleb walked, he heard the faint laughter of Serac and his friends, their mockery fading into the distance as he continued his way to the ravine. The wind howled through the rocky outcrop, a constant reminder that the environment wasn't kind to those who weren't prepared. Caleb ignored it, focusing instead on his surroundings. His boots crunched over the dry surface as he moved, feeling the faint shiver of moisture in the air as he descended into the valley. The ground was damp here, slightly cooler, and the faint signs of life caught his attention. This was where he could find food. Life, no matter how small, always thrived in places like this. He scanned the area, taking in the signs of moisture-collecting plants and strange, alien fungi growing along the ravine walls. As he crouched down to examine a patch of blue moss growing at the base of a rock, Caleb's gloved fingers brushed against its surface. It was brittle, almost paper-like, and the sharp scent that rose from it reminded him of spoiled spinach. He didn't taste it, Not yet. Not until he had seen whether anything lived around it. He looked around again, carefully observing the insects darting in and out of crevices in the stone. Tiny, thin-legged creatures, with translucent bodies. Silverfish, maybe. Life means food, he murmured quietly to himself, recalling the lessons his grandfather had passed on. And food means a chance. He had learned to be patient when it came to survival. The first thing to do was observe. He moved slowly, scanning the ground for anything that could serve as a viable food source. He knelt beside the moss and tested the soil's acidity, using a small scrap of cloth he'd tucked into his sleeve. There was nothing immediate, no life-threatening signs, but he wasn't in a rush. No need to waste precious energy before he could be certain of the plants and creatures that surrounded him. Hours passed as Caleb continued his work. He collected samples, made careful notes in his small, self-made journal, and tested different plants and insects. It wasn't about just surviving, it was about understanding the rhythm of the land, about adapting. He didn't need to be full, he just needed to maintain enough energy to keep moving, to stay functional. A slow, steady consumption of resources was far more sustainable than the quick rush for immediate results. As the sun, or what passed for the sun, began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the barren landscape, Caleb set up his small fire beneath the protective overhang of a rocky alcove. It wasn't perfect, but it shielded him from the worst of the wind, and it provided a place to cook. He had scavenged a few items, dried stalks from a moss-covered rock, some insect legs he had roasted over a small flame, and the crushed bulbs of a bulbous plant he'd found in the ravine. Carefully, he set the small dishes over the fire, each one holding a different experiment. Roasted insect legs. Crushed bulb paste. A sample of boiled moss. He let the fire crackle and hiss, watching the shadows dance across the stone. His stomach rumbled. Not from hunger, he had learned to quiet his body's demand for food, but from the strain of the task at hand. Testing new things. Trying new methods. He knew it was risky to eat too much, too soon, but survival was built on testing the limits. He watched the flames flicker for a moment longer before taking a deep breath and preparing his first bite. The boiled moss was the first to be tried. It tasted bitter, dry, but it didn't burn or make his throat swell. That was a good sign. He made a note of it. The paste, made from the orange-tipped bulbs, warmed his throat in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't painful, just a mild reaction, likely some kind of alkaloid. He made another note of that. The insects were more of a gamble, but he had already roasted one and crushed it into a makeshift broth. He took a sip, letting the liquid run across his tongue. It was salty and metallic, but it didn't cause any immediate discomfort. By the time night fully settled across the desolate landscape, Caleb had learned a lot. He wasn't satisfied with his findings, there was still much to test and observe, but he had enough to keep going. He lay down under his crude shelter, a blanket of woven moss and synthetic cloth, and drifted off to sleep. The next day would come quickly. The others would still be struggling to adapt to the harshness of Varela 3, but Caleb had already learned to trust in the land. The moon didn't care whether they survived or not, it simply offered what it had, no more, no less. It would be the ones who adapted the fastest, the ones who had the patience and the instincts to survive, who would make it to the end. Caleb was determined to be one of them. The morning arrived silently, as it always did on Varela 3. There was no sunrise, no gradual dawning of the light. Instead, the entire sky remained the same deep violet hue, dimly illuminated by the gas giant's distant glow. The barren landscape stretched endlessly before Caleb, each jagged rock and alien plant etched against the perpetual twilight. Caleb had learned in a few hours since the previous night that the key to survival wasn't just finding food, it was understanding the environment itself. The rules of nature on Varela 3 were far different from what he had grown up with. Every step required calculation, every decision had to be deliberate. There were no shortcuts. His success would be determined by his ability to understand this alien world's rhythms. He stood up from his makeshift shelter, stretching out the stiffness in his limbs. His stomach had settled overnight, and although it growled faintly, the initial pangs of hunger were manageable. The roasted insect legs from last night had provided him with just enough protein to keep his energy from flagging. It wasn't much, but it would do. His gaze swept across the valley, his mind already beginning to map out his next move. He had a few options. The ravine still held some promise, though the vegetation here seemed sparse, and the area had already been scoured for anything edible. On the other hand, he could head toward the rocky outcrop farther north, where the landscape looked slightly more promising, a series of caves and overhangs that might offer shelter from the biting wind, as well as potential food sources. But he wasn't the only one hunting for resources. The other cadets, still in their groups, had begun their own searches, their presence a constant reminder of the competitive nature of this test. Survival wasn't a solo endeavor on Varela 3, not anymore. Every decision was now compounded by the awareness that others were also trying to make it out alive. Caleb reached for his pack, a small, utilitarian bag that he had managed to assemble from the materials available. It wasn't much, only a few cloth strips, some dried moss, and a small knife he had hidden in a crevice. He didn't need much. He had always been resourceful, but here, on this desolate moon, even his resourcefulness had its limits. With a last glance at his shelter, Caleb began the long walk toward the northern outcrop. As he moved, he kept his eyes peeled for anything that could be useful. The ground was uneven, made up of small boulders and mineral-rich soil, but Caleb had learned to read the subtle signs of life. He had to remain patient. The last thing he wanted to do was waste energy chasing after something that wasn't worth it. The day dragged on slowly as Caleb crossed the rugged terrain, the wind picking up and turning the air even more acrid. By midday, he had reached the base of the northern cliffs. A series of caves nestled among the rocks, their darkened entrances an inviting prospect. He approached cautiously, remembering the lesson his grandfather had once taught him: the wild can be cruel. The closer you get to a source of life, the more you have to be aware of what might be living there already. Caleb's footfalls were almost silent against the rock as he neared the nearest cave entrance. He knelt, his breath steady, his senses alert. Nothing moved. The air was stagnant, but not foul. There were no immediate signs of danger. He hesitated for a moment, contemplating his next move. Then, from the corner of his eye, he spotted it: movement. A small creature darted across the cave's entrance. It was fast, its body low to the ground, covered in long, spiny fur that glinted in the dim light. Caleb's pulse quickened. This could be food. He moved slowly, his every muscle coiled with anticipation. The creature was quick, but Caleb was faster. He crouched lower, positioning himself for a quick grab. But as he lunged forward, a sharp, screeching noise pierced the air, a warning. The creature was more than just a food source. It was the first piece of a far larger puzzle. From within the cave came a growl. A low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground. Caleb froze. His heart pounded in his chest. His eyes widened as the growl grew louder, then was followed by the sound of claws scraping against rock. He had made a miscalculation. Something much bigger than the creature he had seen was approaching. Caleb quickly backed away, his pulse racing. The growl grew louder, closer. He couldn't see what was coming, but he could hear it, a deep, guttural noise that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had to move, and fast. He turned on his heel and sprinted away from the cave, weaving between the jagged outcrops and boulders. The sound of pursuit was unmistakable now. Whatever it was right behind him. His breath was ragged as he pushed his body to its limit. His legs burned with effort, but Caleb didn't dare look back. If he did, if he hesitated for even a second, it could mean the end of his survival on Varela 3. He spotted a narrow crevice between two boulders. Without a second thought, he dove for it, squeezing his body into the tight opening just as the creature's screech filled the air behind him. He could feel its presence close, its heat radiating through the rock. Its claws scraped the stone, sending tremors through the ground. But he had made it, just barely. Caleb lay still, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The narrow crevice offered some protection, but he knew it was only temporary. The creature would likely lose interest, but he couldn't afford to wait too long. Varela 3's wildlife was unpredictable, and he had to be ready to move at a moment's notice. After what felt like an eternity, the creature's growl faded into the distance. Caleb remained motionless, listening carefully. Silence. He waited for another few minutes before cautiously peeking out from his hiding spot. The landscape seemed calm now, but he wasn't fooled. The terrain on Varela 3 wasn't just dangerous because of its harsh environment, it was also full of unknown creatures that operated on instincts far more brutal than his own. But Caleb wasn't about to give up. He knew this was just part of the test. The wild was teaching him that survival was about adaptation, about learning to outsmart not just the environment, but the creatures that called it home. He stepped cautiously out of the crevice, his eyes scanning the horizon. The northern caves were no longer an option. He'd need to find another way to sustain himself. But the experience had given him something valuable, the knowledge that Varela 3 was not to be underestimated. It could be cruel, but if he played his cards right, it would offer its secrets. The day had already stretched far longer than Caleb had anticipated when he finally found a place to rest. The rocky plateau he had stumbled upon seemed isolated, far enough from the caves and cliffs where the predators roamed, but close enough to the sparse flora that he might find something useful. The sunless sky gave no hint of when the day would end. Time on Varela 3 was a fluid concept, suspended in the eerie twilight that never quite darkened or brightened. Caleb sat against a large boulder, carefully unpacking his makeshift bag. The act was mundane, simple, but after the adrenaline of the chase, it offered a brief moment of reprieve. His hands moved automatically, checking the contents, the sharp knife, a few strips of dried moss, and a handful of small pebbles he'd gathered for possible use later. He would need to find something else to eat soon, but for now, he took a breath and let the stillness settle around him. Yet, even in the midst of that relative calm, something gnawed at his mind. He couldn't help but wonder where the others were. The other cadets, those scattered across the vast expanse of Varela 3, were still part of the game. They had to be. Everyone had their own agenda, their own methods for survival, and Caleb knew that sooner or later, their paths would cross. The thought of facing the other cadets was an unsettling one. This wasn't just about surviving the environment, it was about surviving the competition. The academy had made sure to drill into them the importance of collaboration, of working together. Yet, the tests were always structured to emphasize individual performance. Here on Varela 3, survival was a zero-sum game. There was only one victor. The thought echoed in Caleb's mind like a challenge he couldn't shake. Despite the lingering tension, he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on it for too long. There was no room for hesitation, no room for distractions. Caleb rose to his feet, brushing the dust off his hands, and continued to scan the horizon. He needed a plan. The first day had been a trial by fire, but the next step, finding a more sustainable food source and establishing a safer location, was critical. He could already feel the subtle pressure of exhaustion creeping into his muscles. The constant tension, the mental strain of being on alert, was starting to take its toll. Yet, he had to keep moving. The idea of staying put for too long was dangerous, predators could smell weakness. Caleb's thoughts turned toward the other cadets. His training, albeit limited, had included scenarios of social dynamics. In any survival situation, there would always be the temptation to band together. But who could he trust? The truth was that no one could be trusted, not fully. In the academy, they had all been trained to observe, to assess, and to act when needed. On Varela 3, this meant one thing: everyone was a potential threat. The distant cry of a bird-like creature pierced the quiet. Caleb glanced around, unsure of its source. His instincts told him to stay hidden, but curiosity tugged at him. He wanted to know more about the creatures here, learn their patterns, their behavior. It was the only way to get a foothold on this harsh planet. But before Caleb could make a decision, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a familiar sound. The unmistakable clatter of someone else's footsteps on the rock. He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He wasn't alone. Someone had found him. The figure that emerged from behind a nearby rock outcrop was tall, lanky, and covered in dust. Caleb immediately recognized him, Dante, one of the cadets from his group. They had been paired together in the beginning, working under the assumption that their combined skills could ensure their survival. However, something had always been off about Dante. There was a coldness in his eyes, an ambition that Caleb hadn't fully understood at first. But now, it was clear. Dante was no ally. Did you really think you could stay hidden? Dante's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, something almost predatory. He didn't seem as tired or worn as Caleb, perhaps because he had found a better shelter or more resources. Caleb stood a little straighter, keeping his distance. What are you doing here, Dante? Dante stepped closer, a mocking smile on his lips. Same as you. Trying to survive. The air between them grew tense. Caleb's fingers subtly brushed the knife handle at his waist. It was a gesture that was both instinctive and calculated. He knew better than to let his guard down. You're alone, Caleb said, trying to read Dante's posture. He was the type to underestimate people, especially in situations like this. He wouldn't be able to afford that mistake again. Dante chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You're not as smart as you think, Caleb. You and I both know what's going to happen here. There's only one winner. Caleb swallowed, the weight of the unspoken challenge settling heavily in his chest. Dante wasn't here to collaborate. He was here to eliminate the competition. And Caleb was just another obstacle in his path. A standoff. The tension between them could be cut with a knife. Dante's eyes flicked toward Caleb's pack for just a moment, but Caleb's grip on the knife tightened, ensuring he didn't make any sudden moves. Back off, Caleb said, his voice low but firm. I'm not your enemy. Dante smirked, taking another step closer. Then why are you holding that knife? Caleb didn't answer, but his stance made it clear. He wasn't about to back down. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to stretch, the tension palpable. Caleb had a decision to make: engage in a confrontation that could drain both of them, or back off and try to find another route. The choice was clear. Despite Dante's presence, Caleb wasn't foolish enough to get into a physical altercation without preparation. With a final, steady glance, Caleb turned and began walking, keeping his pace measured and his eyes alert. Dante didn't follow immediately, but Caleb could feel his gaze on him, cold and calculating. He wasn't letting this go. Dante would wait for the right moment, and Caleb knew that moment might come sooner than he liked. The test had just become personal. Caleb moved with calculated precision, avoiding the rocky outcrops and the uneven terrain that could give him away. Dante's presence was a looming shadow now, one that Caleb could feel even though he didn't turn back. His mind raced, analyzing the situation. The immediate goal was to find a better position, higher ground where he could get a lay of the land and observe without being easily spotted. His heart was still pounding in his chest, not just from the close encounter with Dante, but from the weight of knowing that, from now on, this was about more than just survival. It was about outwitting the other cadets. The sunless sky above Varela 3 shifted in hue, but it was impossible to tell whether it was evening or just another phase of the constant twilight. The planet seemed to operate outside of normal time, and that unnerving stillness in the atmosphere made everything feel even more isolated. Caleb had no way of knowing if Dante was watching him or planning a strike from a distance. It didn't matter. He had to keep moving. After an hour of walking, Caleb spotted what he was looking for: a narrow pass between two jagged cliffs that opened up into a more expansive area. It was a risk to head further into unfamiliar terrain, but staying where he was could be worse. Dante would eventually track him down if he didn't make a decisive move. This new location offered him better visibility and access to higher ground, and that was what he needed now. He pushed onward, his thoughts a constant buzz of strategy and counter-strategy. He would have to find a defensible position, somewhere that could offer him some shelter. The rocky formations that dotted the landscape were sharp and treacherous, but they were also useful as hiding spots, or even potential traps if he was clever enough. When Caleb finally reached the top of a small hill, he crouched low, taking a moment to catch his breath and assess the surrounding terrain. The view was far-reaching, a jagged wilderness that stretched across the horizon, broken only by the occasional outcropping or the twisted remains of trees that had long been ravaged by the harsh conditions of the planet. It was beautiful, in a way, untouched by civilization, raw and unapologetically wild. But that beauty was deceiving. Varela 3 was as hostile as it was gorgeous, and it didn't care about the humans who had been thrust into its unforgiving embrace. His gaze swept across the horizon, picking out the smallest movements. Far in the distance, he could just make out the shape of something large moving, an animal, perhaps, though he couldn't tell what kind. His training had focused on understanding the behavior of the local fauna, but there was still so much to learn. The cadets had been briefed on the most dangerous creatures, but there were always surprises. Caleb's eyes narrowed, scanning the movement carefully. It could be a predator. Or worse, it could be another cadet trying to capitalize on his vulnerability. He quickly dropped lower, out of view. The last thing he needed was to be spotted, whether by a creature or another cadet. The wilderness of Varela 3 wasn't kind, but it was also indifferent. He could die here just as easily from hunger or a rogue animal attack as from a confrontation with another human. His mind drifted back to Dante. The coldness in his eyes earlier hadn't been lost on Caleb. Dante wasn't just dangerous because of his cunning, he was dangerous because he knew how to manipulate situations. A person like that would never show their hand too early. Dante was biding his time, waiting for Caleb to make a mistake. But Caleb wouldn't make that mistake. Not again. As night, if it could be called that, began to settle over the landscape, Caleb found a relatively sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. The air grew colder, and he could feel the temperature drop sharply as the planet's unique atmosphere wrapped the surface in a chill. He pulled out his small fire-starting kit, a simple flint and a few small sticks he had gathered during the day. Starting a fire was risky, but it was necessary. He needed warmth and a signal in case he needed to draw attention, whether to attract potential allies or to signal his location to someone watching from a distance. As the fire flickered to life, Caleb watched it with a kind of reverence. It wasn't just a tool for survival, it was a symbol of control. In the midst of a hostile environment, creating something as simple as a fire meant he had some command over the situation. For now, that was enough. His mind wandered as the fire crackled, its light dancing on the rocks around him. The academy had taught them all the basics of survival, but no lesson could prepare him for the mental toll that came with being on his own. Each decision, each action, carried weight. The smallest mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Caleb turned his attention back to the fire, his thoughts focusing. If Dante was still out there, and Caleb was certain he was, then his best bet was to stay as inconspicuous as possible. He couldn't afford to make a scene, to attract any unnecessary attention. The other cadets were playing the same game, but the question remained, who could he trust? Who, among the others, would offer an alliance, or at least a temporary truce? One thing was certain. He couldn't afford to wait. This was the beginning of a long, brutal test of endurance and wit. He needed to stay ahead of the others, find his own resources, and build a defense that wouldn't just keep predators at bay, it needed to keep cadets like Dante away as well. The first night on Varela 3 passed in uneasy silence. Caleb stayed awake, his eyes flicking constantly to the shadows, to the flickering firelight, to the edges of the rocky plateau. His mind was a constant churn of plans, contingencies, and scenarios. Tomorrow, he would have to move again, find better shelter, hunt, and explore. He could not afford to remain stagnant. And he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As the fire began to dwindle, Caleb made a mental note to start mapping the terrain more effectively. Knowledge of the land, of where resources were, of where potential dangers lay, that was his true advantage. No matter how badly Dante wanted to win, Caleb knew one thing: it was going to take more than cold calculation to survive on Varela 3.